Technology usually enters our lives quietly, as a convenience, as something that saves time, removes friction, and feels politely neutral, like a tool waiting for instructions rather than a force shaping them. At first, it assists our choices. It helps us navigate roads, organize memories, speak across distances, and solve problems faster, cleaner, with fewer errors than before. Nothing about this feels like power. But slowly, assistance turns into suggestion. Suggestion turns into default. And defaults, repeated every day, begin to guide how we think, decide, pause, and move forward without asking us directly. Technology starts choosing the path of least resistance for us, not by command, but by design, by what it highlights, what it hides, and what it quietly makes inconvenient to question. Over time, behavior adapts. Attention narrows. Options shrink or expand depending on invisible rules written elsewhere, shaping outcomes long before we believe we have made a choice at all. This is where neutrality begins to blur. When a system no longer waits for direction, but anticipates it. When it nudges, ranks, filters, and predicts, turning preference into pattern. Technology then stops being just a tool in the hand. It becomes a presence in the room, a quiet power, influencing outcomes not by force, but by framing what feels possible, normal, and inevitable. When tools spread widely, power seems to dissolve. Everyone has access. Everyone can use them. But power rarely lives in the tool itself. It settles around who controls its direction, limits, and rhythm over time. Those who shape technology shape time. They decide what becomes instant, what remains slow, and what is delayed until it quietly disappears from attention. Speed, once granted, becomes authority without ever announcing itself. Control over tools also becomes control over information, not by hiding facts, but by arranging visibility. What appears first feels important. What appears last feels optional. Soon, importance itself seems natural, unquestioned. Opportunity follows the same pattern. Some paths are smooth, others made uneven. Doors do not need to be locked if they are simply harder to find or easier to ignore in everyday use. A gentle definition helps here. Power can be understood as the capacity to shape outcomes without direct command. Technology does this quietly, by guiding choices rather than issuing orders. Over time, people adjust their habits to these arrangements. They plan around systems. They trust rankings, timings, and signals. Influence deepens not through force, but through repetition and familiarity. This is how tools become structures. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily as convenience hardens into dependence, and dependence slowly turns into authority that feels less like control and more like common sense. The modern state did not begin with laws alone. It grew alongside tools that could see farther, hear faster, and reach deeper into everyday life than any ruler or decree ever could. Administration first needed clarity. Printing helped standardize orders and records. Forms, notices, and instructions could travel intact, carrying authority across distance without changing tone or intent. Communication followed. Telecommunications compressed space. Messages that once took days now moved instantly, allowing decisions to travel faster than people, reshaping how power felt across regions and borders. Movement mattered too. Railways did more than move goods. They aligned time, synchronized schedules, and made territory legible, binding scattered places into a single administrative rhythm. Counting became another quiet strength. Census exercises turned populations into categories, not to judge, but to know. And knowing made planning possible, from taxation to welfare to security. None of these tools announced themselves as control. They promised order, efficiency, and reach. They made the state visible in daily routines, not as force, but as presence woven into normal life. Over time, authority learned a lesson. Power grows when tools feel ordinary. When systems manage complexity silently, the state does not need to shout. It governs through structure, habit, and the steady background hum of organization. In India, digital governance arrived with confidence and scale, not as an experiment at the margins, but as a central promise of efficiency, inclusion, and speed in a country where size itself shapes every administrative choice. Platforms began to replace counters. Databases started standing in for files. Services once tied to offices and hours moved onto screens, promising access without queues, intermediaries, or repeated explanation. The ambition was unmistakable. One system, many services. One identity, many uses. Digital delivery was imagined as a bridge across distance, language, and institutional fatigue, accumulated over decades. Reports spoke of savings. Leakages reduced. Time returned to citizens. Debates followed just as naturally, asking who benefits first, who waits longer, and what happens when access depends on connectivity rather than proximity. At this scale, even small design choices matter. A form field, a login step, a failed authentication. When multiplied by millions, these moments become experiences that shape trust in the state itself. Digital systems also remember differently. They do not forget easily. They link records, trace histories, and connect actions across departments, creating continuity that paper files rarely achieved. For many, this feels empowering. For others, unfamiliar or fragile. But everyone senses the shift. Governance is no longer only something encountered occasionally. It is increasingly something lived through interfaces, alerts, and updates. India's digital turn reflects enormous faith in technology's capacity to organize complexity. It is a bold wager, unfolding in real time, where ambition meets everyday life, and the meaning of state presence is quietly being rewritten. Preparedness once meant stockpiles, manuals, and chains of command. Today, it increasingly means dashboards, alerts, and systems that can sense stress before it becomes visible on the ground. In disasters, response now begins with data. Weather models, satellite images, and real-time updates help authorities move resources faster than damage can spread, turning anticipation into the first line of defense. Public health offers another lesson. Outbreaks are tracked through reporting systems, test results, and mobility patterns. Speed matters here because delay is not neutral. It quietly multiplies harm. Service delivery during crises also leans on technology. Benefits are transferred remotely. Instructions travel instantly. Verification replaces physical presence when movement itself becomes a risk rather than a right. Recent national experiences made this dependence visible. When offices closed and streets emptied, governance did not stop. It shifted screens, asking systems to carry the weight of continuity. Preparedness, then, is no longer only about readiness of people. It is about readiness of platforms. Whether systems can scale suddenly, withstand overload, and remain legible under pressure. But a digital readiness has its own fragility. Power cuts, network failures, or missing records can slow response at exactly the moment speed is most needed. Resilience now has a technological dimension. The state learns through these moments. Each crisis tests not just policy, but infrastructure. Preparedness becomes a question of whether technology can remain steady when uncertainty is at its highest. As systems grow, they begin to observe, not out of suspicion but necessity. To function at scale, technology collects traces of movement, usage, preference, and interaction, turning activity into information. Monitoring enters quietly. Cameras promise safety. Logs promise accountability. Sensors promise efficiency. Each addition feels reasonable on its own, aimed at reducing uncertainty rather than expanding authority. Over time, collection becomes continuous. What was once occasional reporting turns into constant recording. The state does not need to ask repeatedly. Systems remember automatically, storing fragments of everyday life as routine data. Prediction follows collection. Patterns are identified. Risks are flagged. Resources are pre-positioned. Governance begins to look forward, acting on what might happen rather than waiting for what already has. This shift has not gone unnoticed. Courts have occasionally paused to ask what limits should exist, reminding institutions that efficiency does not replace responsibility, and capability does not automatically justify use. Public conversations echo similar concerns. Not fear of technology itself, but questions of proportion. How much observation is necessary? How long should memory last? Who decides when prediction becomes presumption? Authority, here, feels different. Less visible, less forceful. It operates through anticipation, shaping behavior before rules are broken, nudging outcomes toward what systems define as normal or safe. This does not arrive as tyranny. It arrives as order, as optimization, as reassurance. And that is precisely why it deserves calm attention rather than panic, because power that feels reasonable is often the hardest to notice. Technology promises universality, but experience remains uneven. For some, systems feel seamless. For others, they feel distant, unreliable, or difficult to enter, shaped by conditions far beyond individual choice. Connectivity itself is unequal. Signals weaken across geography. Devices age unevenly. Power supply fluctuates. Access becomes a matter of location, income, and circumstance rather than simple availability. Literacy adds another layer. Not just the ability to read, but to navigate interfaces, understand prompts, recover passwords, and interpret automated messages without confusion or fear of error. Affordability quietly filters participation. Data costs. Device repairs. Upgrades. What feels minor to one household can become a repeated barrier to another, turning digital convenience into recurring expense. Surveys and reports have noted this unevenness gently, but persistently. They describe gaps not as absence, but as friction. People are present, yet struggling at the edges of systems designed elsewhere. The result is not exclusion in theory, but delay in practice. Forms take longer. Benefits arrive later. Mistakes are harder to correct. Inequality expresses itself through time lost rather than doors closed. Digital governance, then, does not touch everyone the same way. It amplifies existing differences in capacity, confidence, and support, even as it claims neutrality through design and automation. This uneven experience matters, because when technology becomes the main path to the state, inequality is no longer just economic or social. It becomes procedural, lived quietly in everyday interactions with systems meant to serve all. Technology does not arrive in a social vacuum. It enters lives already shaped by hierarchy, habit, and history, and often mirrors these patterns rather than dissolving them through access alone. Caste influences how confidently systems are approached. Who feels entitled to demand correction? Who hesitates before a form? Who absorbs delays quietly, assuming difficulty is normal rather than exceptional? Gender shapes interaction differently. Shared devices, limited privacy, interrupted time. What looks like universal access on paper becomes fragmented use within households, influenced by expectations about whose work and needs come first. Region matters too. Urban systems assume speed and stability. Rural realities move differently. Interfaces designed for one rhythm can feel misaligned elsewhere, turning geography into a silent variable in digital experience. Language remains a powerful filter. Many platforms speak formally, narrowly. Translation exists, but unevenly. Comprehension becomes effort, and effort discourages participation without ever explicitly denying it. Disability exposes design assumptions. Small text, timed responses, audio-only cues. Systems built for an imagined average body quietly sideline those who navigate differently through the same digital spaces. Studies have suggested a pattern. Technology often amplifies existing inequality when social context is ignored because systems scale assumptions as efficiently as they scale services. None of this implies intent. It suggests inheritance. Digital systems absorb social structure and replay it at speed, reminding us that tools, however modern, still operate within the grain of society they enter. Crises reveal what routine conceals. When systems are stressed, their strengths and limits surface together, showing how deeply everyday governance now leans on digital foundations. During pandemics, technology enabled continuity. Information circulated quickly. Services adapted. Coordination persisted, even when physical movement stopped, allowing response to outpace uncertainty in crucial, early moments. Disasters told a similar story. Alerts warned. Maps guided relief. Records helped track needs. Digital systems compressed time when delay could translate into loss. Economic shocks also leaned on screens. Transfers reached accounts directly. Registrations replaced queues. Verification traveled faster than people, keeping the systems moving when traditional channels slowed or closed, yet exclusion appeared alongside efficiency. Those without devices waited. Those without connectivity depended on intermediaries. Systems worked well for many, while others encountered silence instead of support. Errors became harder to explain. A missed update. A mismatched record. When access depends on systems, absence from them feels less like oversight and more like invisibility. These moments were rarely intentional. They emerged from reliance itself. When technology carries response, those outside its reach experience crisis twice, once from the event, again from the system. Crises, then, do not just test capacity, they test assumptions. They ask whether digital dependence expands resilience for all or concentrates stability where access already exists. The answer quietly remains uneven. Alongside the state, new power centers have emerged quietly. Private platforms now mediate communication, commerce, and visibility, shaping everyday life without the symbols or language traditionally associated with authority. These platforms do not issue orders. They sort, rank, recommend. Algorithms decide what rises, what fades, and what never appears, influencing attention at a scale once unimaginable outside formal institutions. Market influence follows attention. Small design changes ripple outward, altering livelihoods, consumption patterns, and public conversation. Power here is exercised through calibration rather than command. Unlike public institutions, these systems evolve rapidly. Rules change silently. Interfaces update overnight. Users adapt continuously, often without clarity about why outcomes suddenly feel different. This has sparked debate. Questions of fairness, accountability, and competition surface in courts, committees, and public discussion, not as rejection of innovation, but as concern over concentration of influence. Regulation struggles to keep pace. When services feel essential but remain private, boundaries blur. What is choice? What is dependence? What is market success? And what begins to resemble infrastructure? States find themselves negotiating rather than directing. Platforms cross borders effortlessly. Their decisions affect millions simultaneously, creating asymmetries between national authority and global technological reach. This does not imply malice. It reflects a shift. Power is no longer housed only in offices or laws, but distributed across systems that shape behavior through design, scale, and constant presence. As technology grows powerful, law begins to follow, not to stop innovation, but to place it within shared boundaries where authority remains accountable and power does not drift beyond public reach. Data protection enters this conversation quietly, as a promise that information about people is not limitless, that collection has purpose, that retention has reason, and that memory, however efficient, should have restraint. Accountability becomes harder to see. Decisions are automated. Processes are layered. Responsibility disperses across systems, vendors, and interfaces, making it necessary to ask who answers when outcomes feel unjust or unclear. Transparency is demanded gently, but persistently. Citizens want to know how decisions are made, not the code, but the logic. Not every detail, but enough to understand why results differ. Legislatures respond unevenly. Committees consult, drafts circulate, rules are proposed, revised, paused. Democracy moves deliberately, even when technology moves fast. Courts, too, have stepped in at moments, not to design systems, but to ask questions about limits, about consent, about whether efficiency alone can justify expanded reach. The rule of law here acts as a pause, a reminder that power, however modern, still requires justification, explanation, and the possibility of challenge from those it affects. This work is unfinished. Regulation lags. Debate continues. But the effort itself matters, because democratic control is not about perfect rules, but about keeping power answerable, even when it arrives through screens and systems. As technology settles into daily life, ethics returns quietly to the foreground, not as abstract theory, but as lived questions about how systems treat people when no human face is present. Consent becomes complicated. It is often given quickly through clicks and defaults rather than reflection. Agreement exists, but understanding feels partial, shaped by urgency and limited alternatives. Fairness follows close behind. When systems sort and decide, outcomes can feel uneven without being personal. Bias appears not as intent, but as pattern emerging from what systems learn and repeat. Responsibility is harder to locate. When harm occurs, it rarely traces back to a single hand. Designers, deployers, and users are linked, yet distance blurs accountability. An ethical observation helps steady this space. Power without responsibility erodes trust. Technology tests this idea daily because its reach often exceeds the clarity of its ownership. Trust, once strained, is slow to rebuild. People may comply with systems they do not fully trust, but confidence fades when explanations are absent or errors feel uncorrectable. Ethics here is not about perfection. It is about repair, about listening when systems fail, about acknowledging limits rather than hiding behind complexity or scale. When technology seeks legitimacy, it does so through trust, and trust grows not from capability alone, but from fairness felt, consent respected, and responsibility clearly carried, even when decisions are made by machines rather than people. Living with technology's power does not always feel dramatic. Most days, it feels ordinary. Systems function. Processes complete. Life continues, shaped subtly by decisions made far from where they are experienced. Awareness grows unevenly. Some sense influence immediately. Others encounter it only when something fails, when a system refuses, delays, or redirects without explanation. Restraint rarely announces itself. It appears as absence, as features not built, as connections not made, as choices deliberately left open rather than automated or predicted away. Institutions carry a quiet burden here. They must understand systems deeply enough to rely on them, yet remain distant enough to question them when outcomes feel misaligned with public purpose. Capacity matters. Not only technical skill, but interpretive skill. The ability to read systems, to notice drift, and to recognize when efficiency begins to overshadow judgment. Public understanding moves slowly. Technology is encountered through interfaces, not structures. People experience results without seeing processes, making power feel personal even when it is systemic. This creates a shared tension between trust and caution, between dependence and distance, between the comfort of automation and the discomfort of not knowing how decisions are made. Living with this power means coexisting with uncertainty, not resisting technology, not surrendering to it, but noticing its presence as part of the landscape of modern life, shaping outcomes quietly every day. Technology rarely declares itself as power. It arrives as help, as speed, as convenience. Yet once it begins shaping outcomes, neutrality fades, replaced by influence that settles quietly into everyday life. Choice still exists, but it feels narrower. Not taken away, only guided. Paths appear smoother in some directions, rougher in others, until preference begins to resemble prediction rather than intention. With power comes responsibility, even when it is distributed. Design decisions defaults endure. What is built today continues acting tomorrow, long after attention has moved elsewhere. Preparedness, then, is not only technical. It is moral and institutional. It is about noticing when tools harden into structures and when convenience begins to substitute for deliberation. None of this demands fear. It asks for attention, for the patience to see systems as they are, not just as they promise to be, especially when they work smoothly. Technology will continue to grow more capable. That is not in question. What remains open is how consciously its power is understood, carried, and quietly lived with. And so the conversation does not end here. It lingers like a low hum after the lights dim. Unresolved, unfinished, waiting